Welcome to today's session. In terms of the development of business ethics, let's look at the past 4 or 5 decades to see what has happened in the area of business ethics, at least in the case of US. So we've seen capitalism, which has dictated certain business practices within the context of the US culture. For example, in the 1920s, we saw that the focus was on providing a living wage. A living wage basically means your income is sufficient for educating your children, for recreation, for taking care of your health, and even your retirement after work at the organization. In the 1930s, we saw the focus being on the New Deal by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In that environment, actually the administration blamed business as the cause for some of the problems that people were experiencing in the United States. So he focused on having a new deal. In other words, business was problematic and we needed to have a new deal with the corporate environment. In the 1950s, we saw the focus being on a fair deal. This is where President Harry S. Truman defined such matters as environmental responsibility as ethical issues that businesses had to address. In other words, it's not just the job of the government to address issues of environment, but businesses benefit from the environment and communities where they operate. Therefore, they need to take certain steps to make sure the environment is not polluted. In the 1960s, we saw the rise of social issues in business. Development of anti-business trends seemed to be apparent in most literature. In the 1960s, we also saw decay of the inner cities. In other words, we had more growth of ecological problems that was being experienced around the United States. We saw that President John F. Kennedy focused on the consumer's Bill of Rights. In other words, he said consumers have the right to safety, the right to be informed, the right to choose, and the right to be heard. So the 1960s did have quite a bit where the government was trying to regulate certain business practices in order for businesses to be more socially responsible and more environmentally responsible. So as part of the 1960s, where we were seeing the rise of social issues in business, President Lyndon B. Johnson focused on the creation of the Great Society, where he extended national capitalism with the U.S. government's responsibility to provide all citizens with some degree of economic stability, equality, and social justice for all. And then moving into the decade of 1970s, we saw business ethics as an emerging field in academia as well as in corporate training. Business ethics became a common expression being used by managers and corporate executives. Academic researchers were seeking to identify ethical issues and describe how business people might choose to act in a particular situation. Ethical and legal issues were being defined, things like bribery, what is deceptive advertising, what is price collusion, product safety, and even ecological problems. So that's good that we saw the emergence of business ethics in the 1970s, and obviously that's where academic research began to focus on specific terms in business practices of corporations doing business locally in the United States or nationally in the United States, and obviously those businesses sometimes extend beyond the boundaries of US to global organizations or foreign markets. So in the 1970s, we saw limited success was made to describe how the ethical decision-making process in business worked and to identify many of those variables that influence the process. In the 1980s, we saw business ethics reaches some level of maturity where we had centers for business ethics, which provided publications, courses, conferences, and even seminars to help us become more aware of ethical issues within the business. We also saw the stakeholder theory being developed and researched. We saw the Defense Industry Initiative on Business Ethics in Conduct, otherwise known as DII, which was developed to guide corporate support for ethical conduct. In the 1980s, we also saw the focus of corporations and managers and executives being on the development of code of conduct for their organizations to guide ethical behavior on the part of their employees. So the focus in the 1980s was that business ethics was reaching some level of ethical maturity, and the goal was here self-regulation by organizations rather than being regulated by the government. So the government cannot obviously make thousands and thousands of laws for every activity, but the goal here was to provide some level of ethical maturity for organizations to create their own standards when it comes to making decisions, and those decisions should be in the public's interest. In the 1990s, we saw the institutionalization of business ethics. This is where President Bill Clinton continued to support self-regulation in free trade in the United States. There was government action with health-related social issues such as teenage smoking, for example. Unfortunately, that still seems to be a problem, and that teenage smoking obviously has gone into other heavily regulated drug problems that we're experiencing, not just in the United States, but also in foreign countries as well. So in the 1990s, we also saw the federal sentencing guideline for organizations, otherwise known as FSGO. So the federal sentencing guidelines for organizations set the tone for organizational ethical compliance programs. Now, finally, we have the 21st century environment where business ethics happens to be researched even more than ever before. We thought we'd reach a good level of ethical maturity in business back in the 1980s and 1990s, but in the year 2000, at the beginning of the 21st century environment, we see that business ethics research continues into higher and higher levels of maturity. As a matter of fact, the administration of President George W. Bush in the United States focused on misconducts that were being observed and discovered by big corporations like Enron, WorldCom, Halliburton, and even the accounting firm Arthur Andersen, which caused the government and the public to look for new ways to encourage ethical behavior. Eventually, in the year 2002, the U.S. Congress passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which was the most far-reaching change in organizational control and accounting regulations all the way since the Securities and Exchange Act of 1934. So the Sarbanes-Oxley, also known as SOX, was obviously a big deal for most organizations. So the amendments to the federal sentencing guidelines for organizations, which is also known as the FSGO, required governing authority be well informed about its ethics programs with respect to content, implementation, and effectiveness. They place responsibility on the company's leadership. In other words, top managers like board of directors, the CEO, or the president of that organization. They had to take responsibility for all actions of the organization. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act in the FSGO institutionalized the need to discover and address ethical and legal risk in all organizations. And finally, in the 21st century environment, we see that President Barack Obama inherited the great global financial recession during 2007, 2008, and 2009. The Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act addressed some of the issues which were related to the financial crisis and recession. And nowadays, we see that President Donald Trump decreased the environmental and financial regulations. So this way, in 2016, when President Donald Trump took over as the new administration, they actually pulled out the Paris Agreement. So unfortunately, some people are saying that we are polluting the environment more as opposed to contributing to sustainability and this climate and pollution challenge environment that we're facing. So in summary, let me just mention a few main points. When it comes to the importance of business ethics, our goal is to create an environment or an organizational culture where people are automatically programmed and conditioned to behave ethically. So the term ethical culture is acceptable behavior as traditionally defined by the company and industry that you're working in. The goal of an ethical culture is to minimize the need for enforced compliance of rules and maximize the use of those principles that contribute to ethical reasoning in difficult or even new situations that you or your employees or even your bosses tend to face in the workplace. Globally, businesses are working more closely together to establish standards of acceptable behavior in the industry, in our professions. As a matter of fact, many companies demonstrate their commitment to acceptable conduct by adopting globally recognized principles. The United Nations Global Compact is basically a set of about 10 principles related to human rights, labor, the environment, and anti-corruption. And it is all meant to create openness and alignment among business, government, society, labor, and obviously the United Nations, based on universal principles that we all hopefully would like to implement in our organizations, and we would like our bosses to basically implement obviously on us when we are being judged for our behavior and performance. So overall, the field of business ethics is rapidly changing as more firms recognize the benefits of improving ethical conduct in the link between ethics and financial performance. As a matter of fact, among the rewards of being more ethical and socially responsible in business are increased efficiency in daily operations, greater employee commitment, increased investor willingness to entrust funds, improve customer trust and satisfaction, and obviously better bottom line or better financial performance. Employee commitment comes from employees who actually believe that their future is tied to that of an organization and their willingness to make personal sacrifices for that specific organization. Issues that may foster the development of an ethical climate for employees can include the absence of abusive behavior, a safe working environment, competitive salaries so people can obviously support their family members without having to get a second or a third job, in the fulfillment of all contractual obligations toward employees, as well as social programs such as stock ownership plans and community service that many companies are now offering or encouraging their employees to be involved in. Employees' perception of their firm as having an ethical environment leads to performance-enhancing outcomes both within the organization as well as in terms of brand enhancement outside of the organization. So a company with a strong ethical corporate culture helps to increase group creativity, decrease turnover of the employees, as well as increase job satisfaction for all employees. So the more you learn about business ethics, the more you can actually help your organizations in any profession, in any organization where you work, to make sure that they are socially responsible, sustainable, and good citizens in the communities where they operate. Bottom line, good business ethics is good for business. So that's a little bit about the history of business ethics from the US perspective over the last 7 to 8 decades. Also remember that ethics contributes to better business performance. And finally, business ethics is becoming more than just a function of compliance with the laws. It is becoming an integral part of management's effort to achieve competitive advantage in the organization and in today's globally competitive environment. So ethics has obviously been around for thousands of years, but business ethics is a fairly new concept, which obviously we have seen academically it has become a profession by itself. So we have ethics consultants, ethics researchers, ethics trainers, ethics ombudsmen, and obviously codes of ethics that organizations are focusing on. So I've tried to reinforce some of these main concepts and practices because they're very important, obviously, for the creation of an ethical culture. As always, be ethical and encourage your colleagues to be ethical and hold all of your superiors to a high standards so you can contribute to the creation and maintenance of a highly ethical corporate culture. Good luck. Remember that ethical behavior is a skill. You need to evaluate and improve your ethical muscles in fitness every single day. Good luck.